All right, the third candidate we have for everyone is Beth Meeks. She is a native of Ohio, although currently resides in Louisiana. Just a very brief background, she has a bachelor's in social work from the University of Findlay, and then a master's in criminal justice from Tiffin University. She is currently the CEO of Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So I will turn it over to Ms. Meeks.
All right, so my name is Beth Meeks, and I have just a few slides, I don't know, about 7-ish, which mostly are meant really to keep me on track, right, as I tell you a few things before we move into question and answer. As was just said, I am a native of Northwest Ohio. I actually grew up in Fremont. We know where Fremont is? Right? I know, it's okay. It was a great place to grow up. I'm a little country kid. I went to school at the University of Findlay, went to school at the University of Tiffin, or Tiffin University, I guess it is now. And I've been a nonprofit CEO for 19 years. I used to work at a place called Open Arms in Hancock County, the Domestic Violence and Rape Crisis Agency there, right? Although I've done other things in my past, working with the state and corrections and that sort of thing. So obviously, I have a pretty strong expertise in domestic violence. That's where I've spent the majority of the last 20 years. One of the things that happens, if any of you have worked in domestic violence services, or if you've worked in children's services for a long time, what you know is that there's two kinds of people, right? There's the people who can do it forever and the people who wash out after 2 years. You know what I'm talking about? A lot of people burn out at that 2-year mark and they can't get past that. And so I tell people all the time, one of the things that has allowed me to stay in the field is that I have been able to change jobs and do different things that were all in the field. So I've worked with offenders, but I've worked with children as a child advocate, and I've worked in the rape crisis programming, and I've been an administrator, and it's sort of like looking at the same house through different windows. And so that's one of the things that has kind of effectively helped me avoid completely burning out and getting out of the field altogether. I do have a lot of experience in direct services with children, actually. So I was a child advocate in a domestic violence shelter. I ran groups with sexually abused children for a long time in that 6 to 10 age range. In Ohio, or in Louisiana, we actually just authored what we are told is the first ever protocol in the nation that's a trauma-informed care protocol for what to do with children who are on-site and homicide suicides. Louisiana has an excessively high rate of domestic homicide suicide, and frequently children are present when that occurs. And so we've had some actually really terrible incidents where police do things like say, well, we just thought it was okay to leave the kid in the crime scene while the coroner was processing the body, and so we needed to write some rules down to help people understand that these children are traumatized and that there are other things that are going on that are not traumatizing for adults that are going to create problems for kids if we don't move them to safer environments and help them build a narrative that allows them to process. I have a lot of experience working with the media and doing public speaking. I gave up my anonymity a long time ago in Louisiana. We'll talk about the coalition in a minute, but essentially, I'm the director of all the domestic violence services in the state. And so that means that frequently where I go during the day, someone just shows up with a camera and a microphone and starts asking me questions. I testify in the state legislature all the time. They record that. It's all online. It's public record. And I testify and sit there while the legislators are deciding whether they're going to approve or defeat a bill. And so whatever happens, happens right there, and then I immediately have to talk to the press about that. So there's lots of stuff online about me. There are lots of articles and videos, and if you want to judge for yourself how good or bad that is, feel free. I do a lot of public policy work. You just heard me refer to that, and I'll talk about some of that in a minute. We've had some pretty big victories in Louisiana that have been kind of cool in the recent years. So I have specialized training in some weird things like media relations. I was for a while a certified hostage negotiator. That came out of working with violent offenders, and actually has been more useful than you would realize. I tell people all the time that's the best training I ever took in my career. Not necessarily because I'm still working with violent offenders, but oddly all the same principles apply when you're working with legislators. There's no good way to say it. It's been very useful in learning to communicate with people and how to stick to the point and kind of broker a deal, that sort of thing. I also have some specific training around cultural competence and language access. We have a lot of diversity in Louisiana, right? We have Cajuns and Creoles who are not the same thing, no matter what the people north of the Mason-Dixon line think. They are two very different populations. We have a large Hispanic population, a large Vietnamese population. We have 50,000 people on 11 reservations. who identify as Native American. And the culture south of I-10, which is where all the hurricanes happen, is very different than the culture north of that. We have, a lot of language access problems. We actually have a fair number of people who speak Cajun French. And Cajun French is nearly impossible to decipher if what you speak is real French, because Cajun French has words in it that are literally made up. And so it's not like a really completely documented language. So there's a lot of diversity and a lot of kind of things to navigate there. You can have a program that you're operating in this area that works, and 30 miles away it does not work because the culture is so different. So I'm currently, I told you, the CEO of a place called the Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So a coalition, have you guys heard of this before? CPS and DV people work so much, sometimes they know. Do you know about the coalition? Okay. So there is in every state of the union a designated coalition for domestic violence and sexual assault. They're codified in federal law, and they're designated by the Federal Department of Justice and the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. And believe it or not, all of the domestic violence services under the Federal Department of Health and Human Services come out of that division of youth and family services that the child protection people are under at the federal level. So we're housed kind of in that same division. And in every state, there is only one designated coalition for sexual assault and domestic violence. Sometimes they're combined and sometimes they're separate. In our case, they're separate. And so we are essentially the oversight umbrella for all of the domestic violence programs around the state. So we work with the state to figure out how much money to put in the budget. We work with the state to allocate the money, and then we work to monitor the grants and the fund distribution. So we have a very significant quality assurance program where we go to programs and visit them and interview their boards and their staff people with really. They get prior notice of the visit, but they don't know what we're going to talk about. We go through all of their financials, we go through their policies and procedures, we read what's in their policy and procedures, we ask their staff questions to verify whether or not they know what's in their policies and procedures and how to implement them. We ask them questions related to federal law to make sure that they understand what the laws are that they have to be implementing on the ground, that sort of thing. It's a very intensive system. We do public policy, training and technical assistance, quality assurance, grant monitoring, all of that kind of administrative level stuff. What are highlights of some of the things I've done? I have to tell you, this is terribly uncomfortable because I don't really ever tell people these things. Have you ever had to do this? Like stand up and this is all the stuff I'm really good at. It's like really terrible. Okay, so when I was at Open Arms from 1996 to 2009, we increased our facility staff and budget. We were a little agency, and we really were able to grow into a robust agency that had a lot of programs. We opened a supervised visitation program. We had prevention and outreach activities. We had a sexual assault program and an offenders program. We actually doubled our facilities and staff. I want to say we increased our budget maybe 5-fold. In 2003, and I think somewhere I said I've been working in public policy for about 10 years. In 2003 in Hancock County, we were having this budget crisis, especially around law enforcement. And the bottom was going to fall out of the county budget, and nobody wanted to attempt to raise money because if you know Hancock County, it's very conservative, it's very anti-tax. The last time anybody had gotten taxes successfully passed was 50 years prior to this. And the only option we knew for fixing the problem was a sales tax, a levy. And nobody wanted to do it because they said it was impossible. So we kind of undertook that as the lead agency because the criminal justice work was directly related to whether or not we could get protection for domestic violence survivors. And we actually were successful at passing that levy, and so that was a really interesting turning point in the county. In Louisiana, these are some of the legislative things that we've worked on, mandating domestic violence education in all public high schools, restoring $2.4 million in budget cuts to the domestic violence budget. Governor Jindal has a very interesting budgeting plan, and the budgeting plan included reducing all of the funding for domestic violence programming, and we really were at battle with the governor's office, and we won and got all of our money back. In 2014, we passed legislation in Louisiana that bars domestic violence offenders from possessing firearms. Now, here's what's significant about that. Louisiana is the most pro-gun state in the nation. Louisiana passed a constitutional amendment that says Your right to access a firearm is a fundamental right, like your right to breathe. And so when they passed that constitutional amendment, we had 150 laws about guns on the state books. It immediately wiped out 75 of them. That constitutional amendment was so strong that we did not know if we could restrict violent felons from having firearms. And there were felons who lost their firearms who appealed the cases and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court before the Supreme Court actually said, yeah, you can go ahead and take guns away from violent felons. And so when we passed that legislation, it got a lot of national attention. It was a shock to the world that actually we were able to get that done in Louisiana. So there's this woman named Donna Dees Thomases. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She's the woman who created the Million Mom March. And she's a producer for CBS, and so now she's been following us around filming a documentary about that, so that's been kind of fun. We just passed this year housing protections for domestic violence survivors and their children. And here's what's interesting about that. Only about 20 states have that, and Ohio has been working on that since before I left. They've been working on it for almost 10 years and can't get it done in Ohio, so, which is really unusual because, you know, Louisiana's not really seen as progressive. I don't know if you know that. I know. Okay, we have done a lot of quality improvement in the domestic violence services in Louisiana. These last two things are the things that I'm really the most proud of. The things I'm often the most proud of are hard to articulate, right? So for instance, when I started working at Open Arms in Hancock County, there was a really terrible relationship with law enforcement. There was not a lot of collaboration, there was not a lot of good work going on there. And we were able to repair that and rebuild that into a really healthy place. When I got to Louisiana, literally every state funder and every big important state person sat me down and said, listen, these programs are in terrible shape, they can't pass standards, they don't know what the rules are, and I would tell you now, 6 years later, that I would put our domestic violence programs up against pretty much any other state in the nation. When you go into these programs, they know what's supposed to be happening, they know how to screen people, they know what the federal regs are that they're supposed to be supporting, and it's really done a lot to improve services. Relative to that service improvement thing, we have gone through an implementation of trauma-informed care. So I'm understanding that y'all are starting to talk about that here, is that right? Is that conversation just starting or has that been going on a while? For a while?
But we're really getting into it.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
training and, yeah.
Okay. So have you had like one training or this has been going on for 6 months or a year?
It's been a while, yeah.
Okay. Okay, all right. So when I got to, so in Ohio, we started this whole trauma-informed care thing like 10 years ago. When I got to Louisiana, they had never heard the words trauma-informed care. So we had to really start from the bottom up trying to do training and helping them kind of understand what that meant and how it would affect the service system. So we've done a lot of work there. All right, what are potential challenges for me? You know, I get no candidate for the job is perfect, and what you're basically going to try to do is figure out who's the least less perfect, right? Who's the most closest to best, but still has some deficits. So these are probably the challenges for me. I've never worked directly in the child welfare system, and I told the board people, I've never had a paycheck that says Child Protective Services on it, right? I have worked a lot with with child protective cases because I'm sure we all know 30 to 60% of the domestic violence and child abuse cases overlap. As I said before, I've worked a lot with children. What I will say to you is this. I know more than you think I do about the processes that go on in a children's services agency, but I know less than you want me to know. Does that make sense? Okay. I think that is a place where I would have a learning curve, and I certainly wouldn't want to come in pretending I know something that I don't know, when the fact of the matter is I would need help to understand some of those processes. On the other hand, I think the advantage is this. You have 350 employees and you guys know your processes. I'm not sure you need one more person micromanaging that. Theoretically, a new director is going to look after other things, right? A new director is going to try to worry about the levy and try to worry about implementing trauma-informed care and that kind of stuff. So that's where I'm on that. No experience in direct union work. I have been a union member a couple of times. Obviously, I've had some negotiations training. And have extensive experience in public policy negotiations, but I've not run a pool of employees that are, you know, in a union and had to interact with that system. And there is some discussion about the comparative organizational size, right? I've never been in a building with 350 staff people that are kind of direct reports to one organizational chart. The system is a little looser in Louisiana. There are about 300 advocates around the state that we have some authority over, but they're in, separate offices that run autonomously. And so the number of people that I directly have had supervision of is smaller than in this organization. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my leadership, my management and organization kind of, culture, philosophy, because this was a question that got asked a lot. So my leadership philosophy is this: serve first. I try really to remember that in a nonprofit, what we really are servants for the community, right? That we're kind of giving ourselves to our community and trying to do the best we can for them. That doesn't mean we're doormats. That doesn't mean we get walked all over, but it does mean that we have to approach our work with a certain amount of respect. I try never to forget that I don't own this thing. I hold it in trust for someone else. When I work at a nonprofit, whether I'm on the board or I'm the ED, I think one of the things that happens is sometimes organizations get in trouble because sort of their ownership balance gets off, and they start thinking, well, this is mine and I own it and I run it, and I think that's dangerous territory to be in. So I try to always remember, I don't own this, but I'm holding it in trust on behalf of someone else. The result is more important than egos, and organize your strategies around your diversified personalities is kind of related. So what you will find is, if you walked into my office on any given day, it might not be immediately obvious that I'm the boss, because there might be someone having a conversation that you think, well, it sounds kind of like maybe you should have had that conversation. But what we do is literally say, who's the best person to do this? I don't really care what your title says all the time. What I care is that the best person to do the job gets it done, right? So sometimes we will strategically say, I need you to go have the conversation because they like you and they'll talk to you, and they don't like me, right? And so their motivation to resolve it with you is that they don't want to have to deal with me. On the other hand, we know that there are some people who just maybe they're a little caught up in egos and they only want to talk to the person in charge. You know what I'm talking about? That customer service thing where you're like, I know I'm not saying anything the rest of you aren't saying, but they just want to hear it from the person with a different title. And so we talk about that strategically. We don't pretend that that's real. Do you know what I'm saying? We don't get caught up in believing that that's real or that that's about us. We know that that's a strategy for how to move work forward. My management style is generally democratic and consultative, I call it, which means if something needs to be done, I'm going to go to the key people, including employees, that do that thing and say, listen, this seems to be the situation we have to resolve. What do you think would be a good way to do that? If y'all work out a plan, great. What I do recognize is that you can't run everything like that all the time or you're going to have chaos. And sometimes people can't come to a consensus among themselves. And so this is, the buck stops here. You still have to be able occasionally to be the person who makes the final decision about things. So every time I take a new job, I tell the employees, these are my 5 rules. These are the 5 rules for living with me. And if you can manage these rules, I will be the nicest boss you ever had. Well, one is follow the chain of command, right? Don't leapfrog people. One is do your job, not everybody else's. One is no tattling. None of this coming to my office and saying, so-and-so did such and such, because what I will say is, great, let me get a hold of so-and-so and have them come on in so we can talk about it. We're all responsible for the health of the agency and always tell the truth even if it's hard. I have had employees make big mistakes or something has happened that's really traumatic to the agency. I don't care how hard it is. We can deal with something really difficult. What I can't do is deal with it if you're lying to me about it, right? And so those are kind of the rules for living with me. So the last thing that I want to do is talk a little bit about strategies, maybe relative to the levy and trauma-informed care. Some of this may be things you guys have already thought about. Some of it may be things you're already doing. I would say this. Relative to the levy, I know that when you go back at it, you're going to have some branding, some conversation going forward, right? So you're going to have to decide on some quick taglines about who you want to be, what you are in the community, right? I know that there's a lot of dialogue about you protect children and that that's important work and the community is invested in that. But I would consider talking about that we build healthy families, that we know that healthy families make a healthy community, that that's part of what supports fiscal health in the community, the economic growth of the community. I think you have to acknowledge that the community in Lucas County has a huge sense of ownership over child services, don't they? It seems like more than in other areas. Am I wrong? I feel like it's really strong here in ways that it's not in other areas. And I think to some extent, there has to be public comment made that says, we've really thought about this, this is how we've retooled the agency to kind of respond to the community concerns. I think emphasizing the economic forecast is important. Actually, every single economic indicator for Northwest Ohio has gone up dramatically in the first quarter of 2015. Did y'all know that? Your treasurer produces something called the Wade Wire, and he measures quarterly the economic forecast. So auto sales are up, building permits are up. 20% of the companies in the Lucas County area are hiring, which is greater than the national average. U.S. wages are going up. So we're in an economic recovery, and I think it makes it easier for people to vote for taxes when they know that we're in an economic recovery. The last thing I think that might have to happen in order to pass the levy is to do an analysis of voting precincts, a review of the voter turnout. When are we most likely to get the voters that are most friendly to us? And you kind of have to analyze by precinct where you won and where you lost, because you want to start looking at whether there are any trends in race and income and areas or party affiliation in who you lost with. Now the good news is you only lost by 3,000 votes, right? And that is not that much, that's very close. So even though there was some perceived disapproval in the community, the fact of the matter is your relationship with the community is so strong that even in the face of adversity, you almost met the tipping point anyway because your relationship with the community is strong. So I feel like the possibility that you'll pass the levy, I'm very optimistic about that. I feel like that's something that y'all can do. All right, so these are strategies about trauma-informed care. I'm gonna guess y'all have done this already. Start the discussion, embrace it slowly. You have to do a lot of training. There are a lot of places that produce assessment tools, Futures Without Violence, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the Chadwick Center. And essentially what you do is use the assessment tool to figure out how far you are in the agency from where you want to be, right? So this is where they say to be, this is where we are. And then you have to kind of prioritize what you can change in what order at what pace. And then really you just lather, rinse, repeat, right? You implement a little bit, measure what's going on, implement it in the next place, measure, and kind of keep doing that until you get to what I call cultural saturation, which means everybody in the organization can explain trauma-informed care. Everybody can explain how it affects their daily activities. And it's something that we know we do all day, every day, from the very tippy top of the board to the very last person in the building at night. We all know what it is. That's our philosophy. That's how we operate. And that is really it in terms of what I felt like were major points to make sure that you knew from me right off the bat. I do a lot better in question and answer because I always feel like I want you to get what you need when you leave the room instead of me kind of trying to psychically predict that.
You talked about one of your challenges being that you'll need to really learn child welfare system. How is it you plan to tackle that?
Well, to be honest, I need to spend some time with staff people. So let me back up and say this. I have worked a lot with organizations in transition, and a sure way to fail a transition is to step into the chair and figure out everything you're going to change in the first year. To me, it's that look before you leap thing, right? To me, I feel like you need about a year to kind of just get the lay of the land and see where everybody is and understand what you're dealing with in whole. There may very well be something you pick up on that you think needs to change, but sometimes if you change that thing, you disturb an equilibrium, right? And so you kind of have to understand all the equilibrium. That takes longer than a few months. So the first thing I want to do is just live in the space and get to know people and kind of understand the jobs they're doing. I really would like to walk through a case, right? I would like to walk through an adoption case. I would like to walk through a child protective case as much as I can with an employee kind of telling me this is what's going to happen or this is what did happen so that I can really ask questions and kind of, we could almost have an exchange of information. I think probably if I was asking detailed questions, they would be a little relieved to know that I know something. I know more maybe than we think I do.
There's 1,000 state and federal regs
Yeah.
requirements, most of which you probably have never heard of. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think you'd be surprised how many of those state and federal regs I have heard of. I think that they're, when I worked in domestic violence, we had a lot of cases that went through the child protection system. I'm sure there are a pile of them I haven't heard of. I mean, all I can tell you as an avid reader, there's a huge pile of state and federal regs in domestic violence law. In fact, we have programs who the amount of money for the amount of burden it's not consistent enough, so they just won't provide the programming because it's onerous. And a lot of those regs are the same regs, right? So language specific, class standards they call them, culturally linguistically appropriate services. Those are the same regs. All of the civil rights regs are the same regs. A lot of the confidentiality regs are very close. So there's a piece that I know about, but you're right, there's a piece I would have to study and I would have to have some input and direction from staff about.
I know when you worked at Open Arms, you had, 14-member board?
Yeah, 15.
15?
Yeah.
I think it was mostly the business community.
Yeah, we tried to keep a diversity of, some educators, some, but yeah.
From you currently interact with board?
I do. I have a board at my agency. That board is 12 people, and that board is what we call in the domestic violence world a mixed board. So some of the programs have representatives on the board, and then we have external people who are on the board. And that's a mix of sort of social service people and business people. So there's attorneys and people who work, running government campaigns, as well as the chief of police.
Now, Open Arms, board at Open Arms was more advisory in nature, is that correct?
They're technically a governing board. I mean, they have full voting rights over the agency. They hired and fired me. They approved a budget.
And the board you work with now is a governing?
Yes, just similar to the situation at Open Arms, yeah.
Did you just say they fired you?
No, they didn't actually fire me, I'm sorry.
Just wanted you to talk about that. I just heard you say.
That would be a good thing to mention. No, I was never fired, I promise, I was never fired. In fact, call them, they'll talk to you all about it, I'm sure. But just in general terms, they would hire and fire an ED, they would do strategic planning, they would do financial management. It's a good thing she's capturing this on videotape, so you can all review it later when you're trying to. Mr. Do and Mr. Don't.
Any other questions from the board members? I'm going to turn it over to the staff because frankly, a lot of the staff emailed the questions ahead of time that they had, that they wanted asked, but you've answered most, if not all of them. So if there's any other questions, I'll just open it up to the floor and see if anyone.
Well, I have some child welfare questions, but
Okay.
I don't want to ask them because that's not your area of expertise.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask this question. What do you believe a culturally competent agency looks like?
So I think a culturally competent agency knows its community and looks like its community for starters, right? I think we have to know who lives in our community. So we want to know who, not only how people identify ethnically, but what languages they speak, right? And so a culturally competent agency is just going to recognize that there's a diversity of people. We're going to make sure we have materials in alternate languages. We're going to make sure we have a translator plan, right? We're going to make sure that we have people who look like the communities we're serving in the communities we're serving. You're not going to send a white person to an Indian reservation, to be frank. They won't let them on the reservation to do services, right? They want people from their own culture to do those kind of services. So I think those are some of the elements of a culturally competent organization. I will also say this, I don't think there's ever a place where you reach cultural competence. I think you have to work towards it all the time.
I guess with that, we will conclude.
Sorry.
Oh,
Can
I'm
I just
sorry,
ask one
Gina.
question that's a couple people asked me about you?
Okay.
In Ohio, historically, now we're not this way now, but historically, child protection and domestic violence locked heads all the time. What will you do to help us bridge that here?
Well, I'm just a nice person. I don't think we have to do that.
Not you. Yeah, what
No, I do. No, you're right. That's true. There's this culture of the two kind of at loggerheads. And here, one of the things I think is that neither one of us understands what the other does necessarily. One of the good things about trauma-informed care is that you really have to be collaborative with your community to carry it off appropriately, right? You can't be trauma-informed care starting at the doors, but on the way here, the police have traumatized the whole family. You can't say that you're doing trauma-informed care services, but not have any trauma-informed trained therapists to send these people to. So it forces you to kind of reach into the community and be a little more collaborative. And I think that that's one of the things that happens is that we've got to bridge that gap. There's got to be more communication. There's got to be more cross-training. When I first went to work at Open Arms, I worked in the correction system. And so one of the things that would happen is they would say, well, why in the world didn't the police arrest this man? She told us he blah, 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 blah. And I would say, well, because there are elements of a crime, and if you listen to the story, obviously the elements were not met. So a law enforcement officer can't make an arrest. Well, they didn't know that. They didn't know that that was a rule in the system, right? And so sometimes I think DV workers need to understand that there are limitations to what child protection workers can do. They think that y'all can come in and do all this stuff that's not necessarily true. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of information to learn about domestic violence for child protection workers that actually can make your work make more sense and get better outcomes for families. In Louisiana, that's one of the things that we've done is written a training in conjunction with the state level Department of Child and Families for child protection workers. I don't know that that exactly answers that.
Close enough? Thank you.
Yes?
I just have a question regarding your thoughts about the position. Granted, you don't have the experience in child welfare, but you've applied for a position that's the executive director of an agency. What do you think a day looks like for the executive director in child welfare?
Well, that's a good question because I have that sort of on my list of things to ask the board at some point. But I have a sneaking suspicion that Mr. Sparks' day may not look that much different than mine. First of all, I don't get to choose when my day starts. Someone else chooses that for me, a legislator, the governor's staff. Very rarely do I get to choose when my own day starts, right? I like to come into the office, look through my emails, figure out what I have to do immediately, and usually I have a line of staff people with a pile of things that have to be done for the day, right? And a lot of your day is filled with, even the supervisors are gonna know what I'm talking about. So I have nothing on my calendar today, I'm gonna get a lot of stuff done. And 8 hours later you're going, what did I do this whole day? I have no appointment on here, but you feel like you got a lot of stuff done, but you don't have any paperwork to show for it, right? Because a lot of your day as an ED is sort of coaching and planning, right? It's kind of going around and checking to make sure. I tell people all the time, an ED is like an orchestra director. You don't have to play every instrument, but you've got to make sure that the instruments are moving when they're supposed to move, right? So some people sit out for a while, or some people are working, and some people have to be playing at the same time together, and that's kind of what an ED does. So I don't know that that's a good answer because I don't think most EDs have a good structured A to Z kind of day. Yeah.
I'm going to be the person to ask a really blatant question because everybody here knows that I do things like that. What experience do you have that prepares you for doing something like signing off on a psychotropic medication or a no resuscitate order or a surgery order? What experience do you have that will inform that kind of decision?
Well, I think I don't know that you can ever 100% be ready for that. I mean, I think that's one of the things that you kind of lose if you're not coming up through the ranks, right? I think one of the things that I have to do is rely on the staff people who are staffing the cases and bringing it to me. And they have to be people that I can trust. I think the other thing is this. So for instance, one of the things I do is sit on what's called a pregnancy-associated mortality review. And so, in our state, we track all of the homicide cases, and I go through all the homicide cases. So I do have a lot of experience with people who've been severely injured, who are near death, literally sitting in a hospital with families while they're making decisions about those sort of things, about when to unplug someone, about classifying a death and kind of, whether to rule it as a homicide or an accident and reviewing deaths for that sort of thing. So there are a lot of those kind of things that I've done. Have I done exactly the kind of stuff you're talking about? I doubt it. And do I think I've done some things that are going to be helpful that will translate to some extent? Some.